Bryn's worked at the Health and Safety Executive Chemicals Regulation Division since 2008. He initially worked as an assessment manager, helping applicants to gain authorisations for plant protection products. But since June of last year, he's been working in the operational policy division and is responsible for CRD's Evidence and Research and Development Programme, which is basically looking to develop strategy around new and emerging technologies. So that's what he's going to talk about today. But before working for CRD, Bryn let it be known that he also worked for Marks and Spencer's, much like Phil, and also for ICL Fujitsu as a project manager. Bryn lives in York and is currently working out of his shed in his back garden. So I really hope that it's a well-insulated shed. And over to you, Bryn, for your talk. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. HSE became aware initially through the development of drones and drone technology and people's wish to use it to apply pesticides, that there was this emerging agenda around new technology. And it was obvious that a range of new technologies were being developed that had the potential to fundamentally alter the way that pesticides are delivered and applied. And this could substantially alter the risks associated with their use. So the organisation spent a couple of years making some inquiries with industry and concluded that whilst it was not something that was an urgent requirement, it was going to be very important in the near future. So as a responsible regulator, we concluded we ought to anticipate these forthcoming demands and ensure that the regulatory regime would be fit for purpose. So the first thing we had to work out was what was the overarching policy? What should that overarching policy be? And to be honest, it wasn't really that difficult. It was clear we shouldn't compromise the aim of making sure that pesticides can be used safely, so there'd be no reduction in standards. But we wanted a regime which at worst does not impede and at best actively encourages the adoption of new technologies that improve the sustainability of use. So the line that we tested with colleagues in departments with an interest in pesticides, and one which we've shared with officials in Business, Energy and Information Strategy, the Department for Transport and the Civil Aviation Authority, all of whom have worked on aspects of this agenda. There is an underlying tension though, because the regime for plant protection products we've operated for a number of years has been inherently conservative and precautionary. Some would say that that's entirely justified and appropriate given the nature of the chemicals we're dealing with and the complexity of the risk assessments and the environment into which they are released. The official UK government view is that the regime is overly precautionary and that it's possible to adapt and take a different approach without increasing the risks to people and the environment. We are taking a staged approach, building our knowledge of different technologies that are being developed and the views of those people that are developing them. And we have to make an assessment of the impact of the ways that they're likely to be used and the way that they might alter the risk profile associated with the application of pesticides. We then have to review how the regulatory regime is equipped in terms of not impeding, but actively encouraging the development of these technologies. We're pulling our findings together and we're producing a strategy on pesticides and new technology, which we hope will be available within the next few months. So as I said, the initial focus was mentioned on drones, which is a mechanical robotic technology. And it very quickly became apparent that drones were just a small part of this much bigger agenda. There's the development of remote sensing technologies, the use of big data, artificial intelligence, satellites, drones, mapping fields, and developments with existing chemicals and biological approaches, and even some of the new genetic-based research around RNAi that could have a huge impact on the application of pesticides. But all of these, as people have already alluded to, have the potential to result in more targeted and efficient application of pesticides. And the regulator's task is to understand what these technologies do, when they may be coming to market, and how they might interact with each other, and what would be the impact and consequences of them coming together. And we have to do this in such a way that we encourage the adoption and maintain the standards. New technologies are being developed by a diverse range of organisations, including those that haven't traditionally been stakeholders with whom we normally interact. So a challenge here will be, how do we identify them and then speak to them in a way that enables the dialogue to deliver the most mutually advantageous outcomes? New technologies can be disruptive in a positive way, but running up against a regulatory regime that is by and far largely conservative and precautionary is often a big hurdle. HSE CRD has generally received praise and encouragement for its work within the confines of the regulation, and we now have an opportunity to take that further. The organisation has to continue to develop its understanding and also the understanding that for us, the law also applies to the regulator, and that in very crude terms, we need something, data, a study, a comparison with existing practice to base a decision on. For example, if some radically new technology comes along and the way it deploys a pesticide has the potential to radically alter the risk profile of a product, we need something to base a positive decision on. These are some examples of new and not so new technology. So the challenge for us as a regulator is to respond to this new era of farming and pesticide use. This convergence of technologies and developing this idea of precision agriculture using big data, real-time modelling and connected systems. And against this, the policy priorities for the government and the regulator are to improve sustainability, promote domestic production, promote the export of technological products, and ensure an appropriate regulatory response. And for the regulator, we have to be aware of any potential unintended consequences. So what might drive adoption? James talked about this at some length this morning. Market forces are likely to be the key driver. Does it reduce the costs for those applying the product? So if there's sufficient demand, the market will respond and develop technologies. For example, reducing the exposure of operators, workers and bystanders could encourage the uptake of new technology. Similarly, reducing environmental exposure by using targeted spraying might allow additional approvals and authorizations. Reducing the cost of inputs, pesticide products through reduced volume or staff costs by becoming more efficient would also be attractive drivers for farm businesses. The signs that these are encouraging the uptake, there are signs that these are encouraging the uptake of new technology, but we need to bear in mind that that's not the only driver. Businesses do respond to signals from government and society more generally, and it would be fair to say that the big agricultural and chemical companies tend to be viewed in perhaps a negative light, polluters of the planet, etc. And I have to say that that's a little unfair. They do exhibit a social conscience and recognition that they have responsibilities. And we see this in the big R&D companies specifically, looking to develop molecules which have desirable features in terms of minimizing the hazardous properties and risks posed. Bearing in mind the costs associated with bringing a new active substance and product to market are quite considerable, they do not want to fall at the last step. If there is a direction in travel in the industry, it's away from selling tins of chemicals, and the more far-sighted and larger companies are in the game of selling solutions or yield, and chemicals will be part of that, but by no means the only part. And that brings in the embedded knowledge that James discussed earlier this morning. Ideally, the regulator wants to create a smart regulatory environment, one that directs product development and control solutions in a desired direction, and encourages companies to develop new and safer chemistry, and encourages innovation and the use of a range of new techniques rather than defend old molecules. Market forces will be influenced by things such as the availability of sufficient broadband capability and capacity in rural areas, and the ability of users to adapt their existing skills to be able to use the technologies. And then there's also the use and the sharing of that data that might be captured, which might include fears that it might be used for compliance activity, and that might act as a drag on adoption. So the government can create an environment and send signals that it's receptive to the new technologies, but there will be a range of factors that determine the speed and scope of adoption. Initial work suggests that there are a number of ways the regulator might choose to facilitate the adoption of new technologies. It may be a case of adjusting existing policy positions, tweaking guidance, and/or adjusting legislation. Whatever level changes are made, they have to be rooted in a sound evidential base. The default position is that we start from looking to accommodate whatever we're looking at within the existing regulatory and other structures and avoid increasing layers of complexity. For heaven's sake, it's complex enough as we go on. And we'll only look to deviate from this if it's necessary to deliver the desired outcomes. For example, if a spraying operation falls within an existing broadcast air assisted sprayer risk envelope, and this works for the users and that piece of equipment, why would we need additional data? We should only be doing it if necessary. But there's not only the risk assessment to consider, we also need to look at the implications for users. It's a requirement that you all know that it's a requirement that they need to be trained in the safe form of application. And do the existing training courses and certifications demonstrate this? It's unclear if someone applying a pesticide via a drone would meet that requirement. We'll have to do a bit of work with our specialist colleagues to determine the risks and whether they are covered by existing training certifications. Preference would be that they were. So not introducing a new training requirement or costs for users. This is an issue that ministers have already been approached on, but we have to be aware that we will do it if it's necessary. We also need to consider how it might impact on legislation requiring pesticide application equipment to be regularly tested. Are tests available for any new type of equipment that come along? How frequently might the equipment need to be tested? Are there different requirements, and is there expertise in the test centres and the capacity to cope? The next two slides are a little bit of history, really. The focus to date has been largely on the mechanics of spraying application. There have been many helpful and innovative approaches in terms of reducing the amount of pesticide applied, and it's likely to be these sorts of approaches are likely to be important in the short to medium term, so we mustn't neglect them in terms of comparing them with other technologies that perhaps on paper look more exciting. It's about getting the right balance of where we direct our resources, and this will change as time goes on. Another response, an example of change in the regulator's approach, is this change in scope of the legislation. Workers wearing gloves were rarely taken into, or allowing workers to wear gloves was rarely taken into account in pesticide evaluations. The basis for this was that workers handling plants or working in the fields didn't know what products had been applied and didn't know the reason they might be asked or told to wear gloves. And assessments, especially for ornamental plants, indicated residues from spraying were too high to allow handling when required. HSE commissioned research to investigate if single-use gloves would be protective, and the results were very encouraging, indicating that single-use gloves worn by workers would allow plants to be handled very soon after the application of a pesticide. That's all well and good, but there was a need to raise awareness of the need to wear gloves, and we worked very closely with AHDB to provide specific guidance. So this resulted in changes to the authorization documentation and allowing a greater range of products to be used. And the scope change was the scope of the regulation, and the way we used it was changed with suitable evidence. And this was made available to any applicant. This slide used to be a group of people around a table. I've updated it for the current times, so it's essentially a Zoom meeting, but early engagement is key. If there's new technology that someone wants to use, they should come and talk to us. It requires a different way of thinking and will probably result in a different way of working and raise all sorts of uncertainties. But if we know about it, we can help. So regulatory responses. What are we doing about this new technology? How might we take things forwards? What we're looking for more than anything else is evidence. I've briefly mentioned scope of the regulation. Are there any changes now we're an independent regulator in an independent country? Are there changes to the scope of the legislation and things that are currently considered in scope that we might want to take out. How do we go about gathering evidence? There is the potential to use data extrapolations, so things that are well known and understood, can those be matched to new technology? So comparing existing models with new developments, allowing the new technology to be used with minimal data input, using a weight of evidence approach. There is a potential to introduce a new authorization, perhaps a 3-year non-renewable authorization reviewed on an annual basis. It's issued with data gaps that need to be filled, but there's a question there for the government about, and the regulator, about what those data gaps are and what level of risk would be acceptable to, say, for example, human health for operators in the environment, and how would that authorization be limited to things that are considered new and novel. And that comes down to what is the government's attitude to risk versus the development of food production, and what might be acceptable. How would it be limited and enforced, and would such a thing just be considered as more red tape? In the longer term, how do we deal with applications made in spots or small areas on the basis of a metre squared when the evaluation is based on the amount of active substance per hectare? This comes back to something that Charles talked about this morning in terms of precision or targeted applications and various rates of application. So moving away from that application across the entire field to more focused applications, leading to a reduction in the amount of pesticide applied. And in an orchard, again, what does the regulator do? How do we calculate the exposure for something sprayed on orchard leaves in small areas? And then coming to the connectivity and data collection, how much data is collected, where's it stored, who has access to it, who does it belong to, and also what sort of evaluation models would be required to deal with some of this new technology in terms of smaller areas that are being treated. And with all that data that's being collected, used and transmitted, is there an opportunity to turn that into regulatory information? I don't know, but how would farmers feel about sending details of their pesticide applications to the regulator in real time? Might support the surveys that Dave Garthwaite was talking about at lunchtime. Is there any benefit that would encourage the development of such a system? In addition to this, we've got to continually keep a watching brief on new technology and developments, monitor and appraise them to see where they're going. But also we need to be supporting specific research and development. I've just got one more slide after this one. I mentioned unintended consequences earlier. There are going to be unintended consequences. There already have been unintended consequences of some developments, and we just need to be very aware of all those things that might be happening. That's my last slide. My contact details. If anyone wants to get in touch, please do. If anyone wants to talk about anything, I'm more than happy to speak to you. So I'd like to hand you back to Neil now. Thank you very much.